The morgue was a place where sound seemed to go to die. No echoes, no warm hum of life. Just a heavy, endless stillness. The kind that settles into your bones and makes every breath feel louder than it should. Dr. Frederick stood at the steel table, his gloved hands resting lightly on the edge. Beside him, Christina hovered, her notebook half open, pen in hand, trying to remember to breathe evenly. Two small, still bodies lay side by side under white sheets, the twins. Connor and Caleb, 10 years old, their files said, declared dead only hours earlier. Dr. Frederick was speaking in that calm, matter-of-fact voice seasoned examiners had. "We'll begin with the external assessment," he murmured, more to the air than to her. His tone was low, even steady, but it didn't stop her heartbeat from feeling too loud in her own ears. She forced her gaze to the clipboard. Age, cause of death, pending, and then, just as she exhaled, it came soft, high-pitched, delicate, the unmistakable sound of children's laughter. Christina froze. It wasn't muffled by distance. It was here. The morgue was a place where sound seemed to go to die. No echoes, no warm hum of life. Just a heavy, endless stillness. The kind that settles into your bones and makes every breath feel louder than it should. Dr. Frederick stood at the steel table, his gloved hands resting lightly on the edge. Beside him, Christina hovered, her notebook half open, pen in hand, trying to remember to breathe evenly. Her first day as an intern, and she had already been assigned to something. Heavy, two small, still bodies lay side by side under white sheets, the twins. Connor and Caleb, 10 years old, their files said, declared dead only hours earlier. Christina told herself to focus, to listen. Dr. Frederick was speaking in that calm, matter-of-fact voice seasoned examiners had. "We'll begin with the external assessment," he murmured, more to the air than to her. His tone was low, even steady, but it didn't stop her heartbeat from feeling too loud in her own ears. She forced her gaze to the clipboard. Age, cause of death, pending, and then, just as she exhaled, it came soft, high-pitched, delicate, the unmistakable sound of children's laughter. Christina froze. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It wasn't muffled by distance. It was here. Her eyes flicked toward the door closed. Before we continue, please do subscribe to my channel. Her head turned toward the far wall, nothing, but the sound was still there. Drifting, light as breath, curling into the corners of the room, and she knew. It came from the table. She looked down at the still outlines beneath the sheets. Her throat tightened, her lips parted, but it took a moment for the words to push through. "Doctor, did you hear that?" Frederick looked up from his notes, brow slightly furrowed. "Hear what?" Her voice felt smaller than usual, laughing, like children laughing. He tilted his head, listening for a second, then shook it once, gently. "I didn't hear anything." But Christina didn't move. Her eyes lingered on the curves beneath the sheets, the small shoulders, the shapes of arms resting still. The laughter faded, but the weight in her chest didn't. She knew the sound. She had younger cousins. She'd heard it in playgrounds, in parks, in summers by the pool. It wasn't something you could mistake. Her fingers tightened on her pen. "I'm sure I heard it," she whispered, almost to herself. Frederick's expression softened just slightly. "It's your first day. This place plays tricks on you sometimes. The silence, the smell of disinfectant, the cold. It can make the mind conjure things that aren't there." But Christina's gaze hadn't left the still forms. Even covered, there was something unnerving about them, not the usual pallor of death, not the slack features she'd seen in textbooks. They almost looked peaceful, as if sleeping. The air in the morgue seemed heavier now. Christina felt her own breathing slow. Matching the unnatural stillness around her, Frederick set down his pen. "You all right?" She swallowed. "Yes." Just she hesitated. The laughter caught me off guard. The doctor nodded almost knowingly. Understandable. "But remember here, the only children we have are silent ones." The words settled like cold glass in her mind. Silent ones. She took a long breath in. The smell of sterilized metal and faint formalin clinging to it. Her shoulders stiffened. Against a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. From somewhere deep inside, Her intuition whispered it was real. You heard it, and you're not imagining this. But for now, she stayed quiet. She didn't notice until later that her hand holding the pen had started to tremble, a slow, rhythmic tremor that matched the strange pulse of unease in her chest. The white sheets on the tables didn't move. The boys didn't breathe. The room stayed still. And yet, in some quiet, far corner of her mind, the faint echo of laughter lingered, like the memory of a dream you can't quite wake from. The air inside the morgue felt heavier than it should have been, not just cold dense, like every breath carried the weight of something unseen. Christina's words still hung in the air, trembling in the space between disbelief and panic. "Doctor, did you hear that?" she asked again, her voice thinner now. Dr. Hale didn't answer right away. He was staring at the far corner of the room, as if he could see where the laughter had come from. But the corner was empty, just a row of stainless steel drawers and the dull reflection of fluorescent lights. "I heard something," he said at last, though he kept his voice low, almost unwilling to confirm it aloud. "Probably the vents. They make strange noises." When another giggle cut him off, this time sharper, closer, too close. Christina's hand flew to her mouth. "That's not the vents." Both of them turned toward the autopsy table where the first twin lay. The body was pale, waxy, the lips tinged blue. The Y incision had been made earlier, but the chest cavity was still untouched. The tools laid neatly beside the body. There was no logical source for that sound, and yet Dr. Hale took a slow step forward. His mind reached for science, for probability, for anything to anchor him. Perhaps there was a recording device left on by accident. Perhaps another technician had entered unnoticed. But his gut, trained over decades of clinical detachment, was telling him something he didn't like. He reached the table. The boy's face was tilted slightly to the right, his hair damp with the lingering sheen of the freezer. The eyes were closed, but the faintest trace of a smile seemed to curl at the edges of his mouth. Hale frowned. He didn't remember that expression when they'd wheeled the body in. "Christina, check the corridor," he ordered quietly. "Make sure no one else is here." She hesitated. "You're not now." She nodded reluctantly and slipped toward the morgue doors. They hissed shut behind her, leaving Hale alone with the still form. For a long moment, the only sound was the low hum of the refrigeration units. He reached for his gloves, tugged them on, and leaned over the table. His hand hovered above the boy's shoulder. He didn't know why he was hesitating. He had done this hundreds of times, thousands even. But this time, something inside whispered, "Don't." And yet, he pressed his palm gently against the cold skin. The moment he made contact, a sharp snap rang through his skull, not a sound in the air but a noise inside his head. His vision flickered. The room around him blurred, bending in on itself. For less than a second, he wasn't in the morgue anymore. He was standing in a dimly lit bedroom. 2 small beds, side by side. The air smelled of dust and wet fabric. A shadow moved in the far corner, small, childlike, but wrong somehow. The proportions off. Then he heard it again, the giggle, except now it was right next to his ear. He spun and the vision collapsed, and the morgue snapped back into place. His palm was still on the boy's shoulder, but the skin felt different, warmer. Hale jerked his hand back. "No," he whispered. He knew the chemical processes of death. He knew a body this long out of circulation should never regain heat. Laughter came again. But this time, it wasn't one voice. It was 2. Intertwined, circling him, bouncing from wall to wall. The morgue doors clicked open, and Christina returned. "There's no one." She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening. "Doctor?" His head moved. Hale looked down. The boy's face was now turned directly toward him. The faint smile was gone, replaced by a slack, unnatural openness. The lips parted just enough for a thin stream of air to escape. It wasn't a breath. It was. Whispering, Hale leaned closer, straining to hear. The voice was faint, fragmented. "Under bed. Play." He stepped back, shaking his head. "This is impossible." Christina's hands were trembling. So badly she nearly dropped the clipboard she was holding. "We need to call security." "No," Hale said sharply, though his own voice betrayed his unease. We need to understand what's happening. These boys died together. Same cause. Same time? If something unnatural occurred, it may be linked. Christina stared at him. You're saying this is connected to the cause of death? I'm saying, Hale said, that science explains everything if we look closely enough. But even as he said it, he didn't believe it, not fully. He moved to the second table where the twin brother lay under a white sheet. The outline of his small frame was barely visible. The tag on his toe swayed gently, though no one had touched him. Hallie reached for the shaitan, stopped. There it was again, the whispering. But now it was coming from both tables at once. The voices overlapped, speaking in unison and then breaking apart like two children telling secrets to each other. In a language no adult could understand, Christina backed toward the door. Doctor, I can't. I don't want to be in here. Gay, said Hal said. He didn't want to admit it, but part of him feared being alone. If anything happens, I need a witness. He pulled the sheet back. The second twin's face was eerily identical to the first, same damp hair, same faint smile. And then, as if choreographed, both boys opened their eyes. Christina let out a sharp cry. Hale froze. The eyes weren't alive, no pupils dilating, no recognition. They were glassy, clouded, yet they moved, tracking him, and then in perfect harmony. Both voices spoke. Do you want to play a game, Doctor? The silence in the morgue seemed to hum with its own strange pulse. It wasn't the ticking of the wall clock or the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights. It was something deeper, slower. Almost like the sound was inside the room's stillness. Dr. Harlan stood frozen at the stainless steel table, eyes darting from one twin to the other. There, pale, lifeless forms lay exactly as before, and yet he swore he could hear something, a faint rhythm, steady, deliberate, a heartbeat. But that was impossible. He leaned closer to the nearest body, his gloved hands hovering above the boy's thin chest. Christina, do you hear that? His voice was low, almost reverent, as though speaking too loudly might scare the sound away. Christina's breath caught. Yes. Oh my God, yes. It's coming from the rhythm quickened. Harlan's gaze shot to the boy on the left, one with the faint scar tracing from his jawline to his ear. The sound seemed to thrum from him, echoing faintly through the metal of the table. Harlan pressed his fingers against the boy's neck. The skin was cold and naturally so, but beneath it, faint and stuttering, something moved. He jerked his hand back. This can't be right. I pronounced them both hours ago. No respiration. No heartbeat, no He trailed off, his mind grasping for an explanation that didn't exist. Christina, still pale, took an involuntary step forward, drawn to the impossible. Maybe the monitor's faulty? Maybe before she could finish, the other twins. Fingers twitched. Just once. But enough. The sound of metal instruments clattering to the floor was deafening. Christina had dropped the scalpel tray. Backing away so fast, she nearly collided with the gurney behind her. The heartbeat grew louder. Not one heartbeat. Two. They were out of sync, one fast and sharp, the other slow and deliberate, yet they seemed to answer each other. It's like a call and response. Harlan's pulse thundered in his ears. His training screamed neurological misfire, postmortem spasm, auditory hallucination under stress. But no theory could explain what he was seeing now. The twins' chests rose, only slightly, but enough to make the air in the room feel suddenly heavy. Harlan's voice was barely more than a whisper. They're breathing. Christina shook her head, her back hitting the cold wall. No, they can't be. They've been dead for 12 hours. Just the slow shaping of a word that made Harlan's blood run. Cold. Run. The other twins' eyes snapped open. They were pitch black. The fluorescent lights in the morgue hummed with a low, settling vibration, as though the building itself was. Holding its breath, Dr. Lewis sat slumped in his chair, his hands pressed against his temples. The movement beneath the sheet, and yet the echo of that sound still rattled in his. chest like a drumbeat from another world. He had convinced himself it was shock. The mind could play tricks when exhausted. Fatigue and grief could paint illusions. But the moment he closed his eyes, he saw the same vision. Pale lips parting, breath misting in the cold air. And that heartbeat slow but unmistakable, pulsing under skin that should have been still forever. "Doctor?" Christina's voice trembled from the far side of the room. She stood frozen in the doorway, one gloved hand hovering over the frame. I think you need to come see this." Her tone was wrong, not the voice of a nurse calling for help during a procedure, but the voice of someone who had stumbled upon a truth they didn't want to know. Dr. Lewis pushed himself up from the chair, his legs reluctant, his breath shallow. Every step toward her felt heavier, as though something in the room was urging him to turn back. Christina didn't move as he approached. Her eyes were locked on the slab where the twin brothers lay, or should have been lying. Of the sheets was empty. "What the hell?" Lewis whispered, his voice cracking. The metal tray was there, the toe tag lying crumpled on it like a discarded name. A faint trail of water, condensation, led away from the table, glistening under the harsh light. "I didn't touch anything," Christina said quickly, her voice bordering on hysteria. "I turned around for maybe 10 seconds to grab the record book, and when I looked back, the lights flickered. From the far corner of the room, something shifted. A shadow peeled itself away from the wall. Lewis's breath caught. The missing brother was standing there naked, skin ghost pale, his hair dripping as though he had just stepped out of a storm. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, yet there was a strange alertness in the way his head tilted toward them, and then he smiled. Christina let out a small, strangled gasp. The smile wasn't human. It was too wide, too deliberate, as though it had been learned by watching someone else do it, sir. Lewis's voice was a whisper now, hands raised slightly as if approaching a dangerous animal. "You shouldn't be able to." The man moved. Not quickly, but in a way that was wrong, as if each step was delayed by a fraction of a second. From the intention, his bare feet left damp imprints on the floor. Then he spoke. "Where's my brother?" The words were slow, stretched, and there was something off about the sound, as if it came from a throat unused to speaking. Lewis tried to answer, but the question had hollowed him out. His mouth opened, but only air escaped. Christina was the first to move. She backed toward the door, her hands fumbling for the latch. "Doctor," the lights went out, total blackness. Somewhere in that suffocating dark, there was a sound. Not laughter this time. Not even breathing. It was a heartbeat, and it was right behind them, if you want. Taking the blackout moment and dragging it into a full-blown sensory nightmare. The sound of the heart monitor faded, replaced by a hollow ringing, like the echo of footsteps in a long, empty hallway. Ethan opened his eyes, but the world around him was not the hospital room. It was 1997. He stood in a dim, yellow-lit living room, the wallpaper peeling, the carpet stained from years of quiet neglect. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, and the faint tang of spilled beer. A man slumped in an armchair, unshaven, shirt half-buttoned, his gaze fixed on a muted television, flickering blue. Ethan froze. It was his father, not the way he remembered from the old photographs, the smiling man at a fishing pier, the one with broad shoulders and sunburnt cheeks, but the broken version. The one that had vanished from Ethan's life when he was only 8. The man took a long drag from his cigarette, exhaling slow streams that curled toward the ceiling. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, not looking away from the screen. Ethan's voice trembled. I don't understand." "How you think the past is dead," the man interrupted, "but it's just sleeping, and you came to wake it." Ethan stepped closer, his eyes locked on the familiar lines of his father's face, the tired eyes, the deepening wrinkles. "Why are you showing me this?" His father finally turned toward him. And in that moment, Ethan realized this wasn't exactly his father. The eyes were wrong, too dark, too knowing. "This is where it started," the man said. "The first crack. Before the dreams. Before the hospital. Before everything you think you're running from." Ethan's skin prickled. The first crack. Of what? Instead of answering, the man motioned toward the hallway. Ethan hesitated. But something, maybe instinct, maybe that same silent force that had pulled him into the basement dream, pushed him forward. He walked down the narrow corridor, each step sinking into the musty carpet, until he reached a half-open door. Inside was his childhood bedroom. The same blue curtains, the same wooden desk with the wobbly leg, same baseball glove worn soft from afternoons in the park, but sitting on the bed was a boy, small, pale, with wide brown eyes. His own eyes. The boy looked up slowly, as if sensing Ethan's arrival long before he appeared. The power was gone for hours. Mom lit candles. In the kitchen, the boy shook his head. That's not what happened. Ethan's breath caught. What do you mean? You woke up? The boy said simply. Not from sleep. From them. Before Ethan could ask who they were, the bedroom began to ripple. The walls bent inward, the floor stretching away like taffy. The air grew cold, and that same whisper he'd heard in the hospital dream, the one that wasn't in any human. Language slid back into his ears. The boy leaned closer. Ow. They found you that night, and you let them in. Ethan stepped back, his heartbeat pounding. This isn't real. This is just my brain, the injury. It's messing with my memories. The boy tilted his head, studying him. If it's not real, why do you remember the smell? And Ethan did. It's the metallic electric scent, like ozone after lightning, but sharper, heavier, almost like blood in the rain. It rushed into his senses, and he felt it again that same moment from years ago, when he had been 8 years old, lying in bed during the storm. The power had gone out. He had opened his eyes to find not darkness, but a dim bluish glow at the corner of the room, and in that glow, something moving. The vision twisted again, dragging him deeper into the memory until he was no longer standing as an adult, but lying in the bed as a child. Staring at the shifting light, the glow pulsed, and then a shadow stepped out of it. Tall. Thin and wrong in every proportion. Shoulders too narrow, arms too long, head tilting unnaturally to one side. Its face was blank. Not featureless, but shifting like oil on water, showing one expression, then another. Too fast to catch, it stood there for a long time, not moving, just watching, and then it leaned forward, impossibly, as if its spine were a rope, until its head hovered inches from the boy's. That same electric metallic smell filled the air. Ethan. The whisper wasn't from the thing's mouth. It came from inside his head. He wanted to scream, but his body wouldn't respond. His small hands clutched the blanket, knuckles white. But his voice was gone. The thing reached out one hand, or what should have been a hand, and placed it gently against his forehead. In that instant, the world split. Not in light, not in sound. In time, every moment of his life, past, present, and future, opened like a deck of cards spilling onto the floor. He saw his own face at different ages, faces he hadn't yet grown into. He saw hospital beds. He saw strange cities he didn't recognize. He saw people crying, saw himself standing in a forest at night, staring at something enormous between the trees, and then nothing. The memory ended. Memory ended. Ethan blinked, back in the childhood room. The boy version of himself was still sitting on the bed watching him. You don't forget something like that, the boy whispered. You only pretend to. Ethan's hands trembled. Why are you showing me this now? 'Cause they're back. A deep vibration rumbled through the room. Not sound, but something felt in the bones. The air shifted, and the blue glow returned, spilling in from under the door. The boy didn't move. They know you're awake again. The glow grew brighter. The whispering returning in that impossible language, sliding around Ethan's ears, his mind, his very thoughts. He staggered back toward the hallway, desperate to escape, but the carpet felt like wet sand, dragging at his feet. From behind the bedroom door, a tall shadow began to stretch into the room, edges flickering like static. Ethan's heart slammed in his chest. I'm not a kid anymore, he shouted, though his voice cracked. Not afraid of you. Shadow paused, and then without warning, it moved a sudden. liquid-fast motion straight toward him. Ethan stumbled, fell backward, and opened his eyes. The hospital ceiling stared down at him again, sterile white, the faint beep of the heart monitor back in his ears. Sweat soaked his gown. His breath came in ragged bursts. But in the corner of the room, just for a moment, he thought he saw a faint, bluish glow, and the smell that metallic electric temps still lingered in the air. Detective Harris sat across from Emma in the quiet interview room, its walls painted a dull beige that made the air feel heavier. The hum of the overhead light was the only sound for a few moments. Harris didn't speak right away. He was watching her not in an intimidating way, but as if studying a fragile page in an ancient book, one that might crumble if handled too. Roughly, "I'm not here to accuse you," he finally said, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. "But I need you to be honest with me. There's more to this than a sudden outburst in a grocery store. You knew Rachel Monroe?" Emma's fingers tightened around the cup of water she'd been given. "I told you, I just—" "No," Harris interrupted gently. "You knew her. Maybe not in the way most people would expect, but I can see it in your eyes. You weren't looking at her like she was a stranger?" Emma's gaze dropped to the table. Her mind tugged unwillingly toward the past. A part of her wanted to stay silent, to keep the lid on a box she'd buried deep. But another part, the part that had been screaming inside her for years, knew the truth had teeth, and it would keep biting until it was spoken aloud. "She wasn't always Rachel Monroe," Emma said slowly. "Before she married into the Monroes, before the money and the diamonds, she was." She hesitated, the next words catching in her throat. "She was Sarah Collins, my sister." Harris didn't flinch, but his pen stopped moving. "Your sister? Half-sister?" Emma corrected. "We shared a father. He was a complicated man." The room seemed to close in as the memory unfolded. Years earlier, 1998. Remembered the narrow two-bedroom house they'd grown up in, a peeling white exterior, a porch that sagged in the middle, and a kitchen that smelled of stale coffee and burnt toast. Her father, David Collins, had been a man of extremes. One moment warm and affectionate, the next cold and unreachable. Sarah was older by 4 years. She'd been the golden child, bright, ambitious, with a laugh that could win over even the grumpiest neighbors. But the household had cracks that widened with time. David worked odd jobs, always chasing the next paycheck, but never holding one long enough. Their mother, Ami's mother, had left when Emma was 6. She'd had enough of the chaos, leaving Emma behind with a man who loved his children, but loved his secrets more. The secret came in the form of another woman, Sarah's mother. Long gone by the time Emma was old enough to understand the tangled mess of it all. Sarah had been living with her grandmother for most of her childhood, but would visit on weekends. Those weekends had been a strange mix of joy and tension. "I used to look forward to her visits," Emma told Harris. "We'd sit in my room and talk about everything: school, books, what we wanted to be when we grew up. She promised me we'd both get out of that house one day. It's fair. But she was also carrying things she never told me back then." Harris leaned back. "Things like what?" Emma hesitated, then continued. "Our father. He wasn't the man people thought he was. He had a temper, not the kind that exploded all at once, more like the kind that chipped away at you until you started breaking apart, could make you feel like the smallest person in the room with just a look. And Sarah, she got the worst of it when she was there. 2001, by the time Sarah was 18, she barely came around anymore. Rumor had it she'd fallen in with a wealthy older man, a man who could give her everything she'd never had growing up. When Emma asked her about it during one rare visit, Sarah had just smiled and said, "Sometimes survival looks like love. You'll understand when you're older." The next year, Sarah vanished from Emma's life completely. No calls, no letters. Their father wouldn't talk about her, and when Emma pressed, he'd just say, "She made her choice." It wasn't until years later that Emma saw Sarah again, this time on the front page of a business magazine, standing beside Henry Monroe, heir to the Monroe Holdings empire. She was unrecognizable, her hair sleek and expensive, her smile polished to perfection. And just like that, Sarah Collins was gone, replaced by Rachel Monroe. "I tried to reach out," Emma told Harris. I wrote letters, sent emails, even showed up at one of their charity events. She looked right through me, like she didn't know who I was. I thought maybe I'd imagined our childhood, like it was just a story I'd made up to explain why. I felt so abandoned. Harris's voice was low. But you didn't imagine it. No, Emma said, her voice trembling. When I saw her in that store, something in me just snapped. I wasn't seeing Rachel Monroe, the socialite. I was seeing my sister, the girl who promised me we'd get out together, standing there, with a cart full of organic fruit and expensive wine, pretending I didn't exist. Harris tapped his pen against the notebook. So you confronted her? Emma nodded. I asked her why. Why she left. Why she never came back for me. And she looked scared. It's not of me, but like someone was watching her, even there. She told me to leave before he saw us. Who's he? Emma shook her head. I don't know. But whoever it is, she's still afraid of him. Harris closed his notebook slowly, his mind turning over the new information. The Monroe family had skeletons hide. Known that much from his years on the force, but this was different. This wasn't just about wealth and power. This was personal, Emma, he said carefully. If what you're saying is true, your sister might be in danger. If she's tied to something or someone dangerous, you could be too. Emma's eyes were wet but steady. I've lived in danger my whole life. Just didn't realize until now how deep it went. The detective stood sliding the notebook under his arm. Then we're going to have to go deeper. But I need you to be ready. Families like the Monroes, they don't take kindly to people digging into their past. Emma's pulse quickened. I'm not afraid of the truth anymore, Harris gave her a look that was half warning, half respect. Good. Because the truth has a way of pulling everything else up with it, things you might wish had stayed buried. As he left the room, Emma sat alone, her fingers tracing the condensation on her water cup. For the first time in years, the memories didn't feel like ghosts. They felt like keys to doors she'd never dared to open. Yet the week that followed was unlike anything Emily had ever experienced at Monroe Holdings. Not because the office looked different. The polished glass still shimmered in the morning light. The marble floors still echoed with hurried footsteps, but because the atmosphere felt altered. It was as though the air itself had learned to listen. Day one whispered greetings on Monday morning. Emily walked into the office and found people offering her polite nods. Where there had once been dismissive glances, some even smiled, tentative. Unsure, but genuine enough to make her wonder if they were really smiling at her or simply at the idea of avoiding trouble in the break room. Daniel, the analyst who'd once told her she was too quiet to survive here, stood up from the best seat near the window and gestured for her to take it. She hesitated, half expecting a sarcastic remark, but it never came. Instead, he simply said, "Coffee's fresh." Emily thanked him softly, her fingers curling around the warm mug. She couldn't tell if the gesture was an apology, a peace offering, or a subtle way of saying he was watching her now. Whatever it was, it unsettled her just as much as it comforted her. Day 3, avoidance and eyes, by Wednesday. It became clear that some people were steering clear of her entirely. Those who had once been quick to mock her accent or underestimate her work now found urgent reasons to be somewhere else whenever she appeared. It wasn't open hostility anymore. It was something stranger, a sort of careful, measured distance. The more they avoided her, the more she felt the weight of other eyes on her, eyes that lingered too long, watching her from doorways, behind computer screens, or reflected in the glass conference room walls. Once, when she caught her reflection in the polished metal of the elevator, she saw someone standing just a little too far back to be riding. With her, the doors closed before she could ask who it was. The memo. That wasn't Thursday morning brought the most curious moment of all. Emily arrived at her desk to find a plain white envelope resting against her keyboard. No name, no company, letterhead, just her initials written in neat, familiar handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It read, "Watch the elevators, especially after 6 p.m. That was it. No signature, no explanation. She folded it, quickly tucking it into her notebook before anyone could notice. That afternoon, she couldn't help glancing toward the elevators every time the doors opened. Once, at exactly 6:07 p.m., she saw a tall man in a navy suit step out holding nothing but a leather briefcase. She didn't recognize him, yet something about the way he scanned the empty lobby before walking off made her think he wasn't just an employee. A change in Mr. Grant all week. Emily barely saw Mr. Grant, the CEO who had been at the center of last Friday's chaos. But on Friday morning, he appeared in the lobby, not with his usual entourage, but alone. He walked differently now, slower, as though he was measuring each step against some invisible memory. When his eyes briefly met Emily's from across the room, there was no arrogance in them, only a quiet acknowledgement. Like two people who had shared a secret they could never fully speak aloud, she thought. He might approach her. Instead, he turned toward the private elevators and disappeared. Friday night, unplanned return. Emily had no reason to stay late that Friday, yet she found herself lingering at her desk, finishing reports she could have easily done at home. Something about the week had left her feeling that leaving early might mean missing something important. At 6:14 p.m., she gathered her things and headed toward the elevators. Just as she reached the corner, she heard the faint ding of the farthest lift, the one rarely used. The doors opened to reveal no one, but inside, on the brushed metal floor, was a single black leather glove. Emily bent down to pick it up, but before her fingers touched it, the elevator doors began to close. Her heart raced. She stepped back, letting them seal shut, and watched as the floor display lit up with numbers: B3, B4, B5. Levels that didn't appear on the building's public directory. The restless night, she didn't sleep well that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the glove lying alone in the elevator. She thought about the anonymous note, about the stairs, about Mr. Grant's changed expression. The building wasn't just an office tower. She was certain of it now. It had other layers, not just floors beneath the lobby, but histories buried under silence. Sunday decision by Sunday afternoon. Emily knew she had two choices. She could pretend the week had been nothing more than odd office politics, or she could begin to follow the threads that were quietly, persistently weaving themselves around her. Her father's voice came back to her, the one that told her stories in the living room after long shifts. If something keeps knocking at your door, Emily, it's either danger or destiny, and you won't know which until you open it. On Monday, she would not just watch the elevators, she would step inside. That evening, the diner felt quieter than usual, not because there were fewer customers, if anything. The tables were busy with the Friday crowd, but because something inside her was quieter. Lila moved between tables with practiced grace, her apron brushing lightly against her jeans, the faint scent of coffee clinging to her hair. She kept smiling, kept serving, but underneath there was a hush in her heart. Tomorrow, something was going to change. She didn't know exactly what, but she could feel it, the way you can sense a shift in the air before a storm, and it had everything to do with him, the boy. In the corner booth, she'd fed him for months now. Sometimes it was pancakes, sometimes grilled cheese with extra fries, sometimes just a warm cup of soup on a cold day, always without charging him, always without making him feel like it was charity. He had learned not to refuse her kindness, though in the beginning, he always did. Now, when she set the plate down, he would look up at her with those deep, guarded eyes, nod slightly, and whisper, "Thank you." That was it. No long conversations, no spilling of secrets, but somehow it was enough. Lila didn't press. She didn't ask about his parents. She didn't pry about where he went after leaving the diner each night. She just kept showing up for him. Tonight, however, he seemed different. Not restless, he was never exactly that, but more alert. He kept glancing toward the window, as though watching for someone. When she refilled his cup of hot chocolate, she tilted her head, her voice gentle, expecting company. His eyes darted up, and for the first time, there was something like a smile, quick, almost shy. "No," he said softly, "just thinking." By closing time, most customers had left, the air carrying the warm scent of baked pie and fresh coffee. Grounds, the boy lingered in his usual spot, sipping the last of his drink. Leela wiped down the counter, feeling a strange ache in her chest. She didn't want to say goodbye tonight, not because she feared never seeing him again, but because she felt the weight of a moment she couldn't name. When he finally slid out of the booth, he paused by the counter. He didn't look at her directly, he never did for long, but his voice was steady. "Thank you for everything, Miss Lila." She smiled. "You've said that before, not like this," he replied. Something about the way he said it made her throat tighten. Before she could respond, he was already walking toward the door. The bell above it chimed softly as he stepped. Out into the night, Lila finished, locking up, her thoughts circling in slow loops. It was late, close to midnight, when she finally stepped outside. The street was empty, except for a faint mist curling along the pavement, the kind of night that feels like it's holding its breath. She glanced down the block, half expecting to see him, but there was only the quiet glow of the street lamps. Back home, her apartment felt unusually small. The ticking clock on the kitchen wall was loud in the stillness. She made herself tea, sat at the little table, and stared out the window. Her mind kept replaying that last look on his face. There was something final in it. Not sad, exactly, but resolved. She thought of all the times she'd seen him staring into space, or so his brow furrowed, as though carrying a burden too heavy for someone his age. She had wondered, silently, if anyone else in his life noticed. If anyone else cared enough to ask. That night, she barely slept, each time she drifted off. She would dream of him standing outside the diner in the rain, or walking away down an empty street, always leaving, always disappearing before she could. Call out by dawn, her chest ached with an uneasy anticipation. Tomorrow. Tomorrow was going to be different. She didn't know how she knew. She just did. And somewhere, not far from her little apartment, the boy sat on the cold floor of a dimly lit room, staring at a folded piece of paper in his hands. The writing on it was smudged, as though someone had held it for too long. He read the words over and over. Then, quietly, he slipped the note into his pocket. Tomorrow was going to change everything. The first light of dawn crept into the diner in a pale, gentle glow, brushing across the polished counter and the neatly stacked menus. Outside, the quiet street still carried a sleepy hush, broken only by the soft coo of morning pigeons. Inside, everything smelled faintly of coffee and warm bread, a scent that always made the place feel like home. Martha moved about quietly, her hands working from years of habit, turning on the coffee maker, wiping down the counter, setting up the bread baskets. The world before sunrise had always been her sanctuary, a place where thoughts could wander without interruption. But this morning, something felt different. She didn't know if it was the stillness in the air, the way her heart seemed to beat a little faster for no reason at all. Perhaps it was because of the boy. She hadn't seen him in 3 days. And though she told herself he might simply be staying somewhere else for a while, her mind kept circling back to worry. It wasn't like him to disappear without at least. Walking by the window, Martha's eyes drifted to the table in the corner, his table, the one by the window with the tiny chip in the wood, where he always sat with his head down, eating slowly, as if trying not to be noticed. Her heart tugged. She had left the little brown paper bag behind the counter, ready for him if he showed up. A sandwich, a muffin, a small carton of milk, just in case. The front door jingled softly. She turned quickly, expecting a customer. But it was only Mr. Henson from the bakery across the street, stopping in to drop off the fresh rolls. "Morning, Martha," he said with a polite nod, placing the warm paper bag on the counter. "Morning," she replied with a faint smile. But even as they exchanged the usual pleasantries, her gaze kept flicking toward the door, half hoping the next sound of the bell would be him. By the time the clock ticked toward 8:30, the usual morning crowd had started to trickle in. Mailman with his strong coffee and scrambled eggs, 2 teachers from the elementary school sharing toast and quiet conversation, a young mother with a restless toddler. But still, no sign of the boy. Martha's chest tightened. She tried to brush it off. Maybe he'd overslept. Maybe he'd come by later in the day. But something in her bones told her this wasn't just a late morning. It was as she was refilling a customer's cup that she noticed it through the large front window. Parked across the street near the alley entrance sat a dark sedan she didn't recognize. Its windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside. She wouldn't have paid much attention, except she could feel eyes on the diner watching. She paused mid-pour. The hairs on her arms rose. The car didn't move for a few seconds. She stood frozen, the hum of the diner fading into the background. And then, just as suddenly as she'd noticed it, the sedan's engine started. It rolled away slowly, turning down the street until it disappeared from sight. Martha forced herself to breathe, telling herself it was nothing. Maybe just someone waiting for a friend. Maybe a delivery driver lost in the wrong part of town. But the uneasy feeling didn't leave at 9:05. She made a decision. When the breakfast rush thinned, she untied her apron, slipped her cardigan back on, and told Ruthie, the other waitress, she was stepping out for a few minutes. Ruthie gave her a knowing glance. She'd heard Martha mention the boy before, but didn't ask questions. The morning air was crisp as she crossed the street, walking toward the narrow alley that led behind the hardware store. It was the same way she'd seen the boy come from more than once. Her footsteps slowed as she turned into the alley. Halfway down, she stopped. Leaning against the wall, almost hidden behind a stack of old crates, was a small paper bag, the same kind the boy often carried. This one had been torn open, its contents spilled. A bruised apple lay on the ground beside a crumpled sandwich wrapper. Martha's heart sank. She crouched down, picking up the bag. The paper was damp, as if it had been sitting there all night. There was no sign of the boy, no sign of anyone. Straightened slowly, scanning the alley, a stray cat darted past, disappearing into a gap between buildings. The quiet pressed in around her. She almost turned back until she noticed something else. Just beyond the crates, tucked near a side door to the hardware store, lay a single black baseball cap, the boy's cap. She was certain of it. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The brim was slightly frayed, and on the inside, in faint blue ink, were the letters DS, the same initials she'd glimpsed once before when he'd taken it off to wipe his brow. Martha clutched the cap too. Her chest, a wave of dread settled over her. Heavier than anything she'd felt before. Something had happened, and she wasn't going to just stand by and wonder. Without another glance, she hurried back to the diner, her mind racing with questions. Who had been in that dark sedan? Why had the boy's belongings been left behind? And where was he now? Inside, she placed the cap and the crumpled paper bag gently on the counter, as if they might break. She poured herself a fresh cup of coffee, but barely touched it. By the time the church bells down the street chimed the half hour she'd made up her mind, she was going to find him, even if it meant digging into places she'd never dared to look before. If you want, I can move directly into part 10, The Quiet Search, where Martha starts following faint clues and crosses paths with someone who might know more about the boy. The air outside had turned heavy and metallic, as though the night had swallowed something it wasn't meant to digest. By the time Christina and Detective Hale reached the county morgue, it was just after 4 a.m. The parking lot was empty, except for one flickering street lamp that buzzed like a persistent insect. Christina hesitated before stepping out of the car. She could see the building ahead, pale brick, tall, shadowed windows, and the faint yellow glow from the security office, but something about it felt wrong. The windows looked darker than they should have been, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something inside already knew they were coming. You ready? Halle asked, his hand hovering near the butt of his sidearm. Christina didn't answer. She wasn't sure what ready even meant anymore. The automatic doors slid open with a slow hiss, and a wave of cold, disinfected air rolled over them. But beneath it, just faint enough to question, was something else. Not decay, not formaldehyde. Something almost sweet, like burnt sugar. Inside, the front desk was unmanned. The security guard, who should have been stationed there, wasn't anywhere in sight. Hale frowned and tapped the bell on the counter. Ding, no response. Stay close, he muttered. They moved past the lobby into the main hallway. Christina's shoes made soft clicks against the linoleum, echoing louder than they should have in the dead silence. Hale's flashlight beam swept over the walls, lingering on the framed photos of county coroners through the decades. About halfway down the hall, they heard a faint sound, like someone humming. Christina froze. The melody was childlike. Not tuneful enough to be an actual song, but close enough to be unsettling. "It's coming from autopsy room 3, Hale whispered. Christina knew that room. It was where the twins had been taken earlier that night. The humming stopped as they approached. Hale gripped the doorknob, took a slow breath, and pushed the door open. Inside, the fluorescent lights were on, casting a pale, sterile glow over the stainless steel tables. The 2 autopsy slabs in the center were occupied. The twins lay there, side by side, under thin white sheets pulled up to their chests. But they weren't alone, eh? A man in a white lab coat stood at the foot of the tables. Back to them, head slightly tilted as if he were listening to something. His hands were clasped behind him. "Dr. Carson?" Hale called, his voice low but firm. The man didn't turn. Hale stepped forward. "Carson, it's Detective Hale. We need to—" Carson moved then, but not like someone startled. More like someone acknowledging an expected guest. He turned his head just enough for Christina to see his profile. His skin was pale, his lips drawn tight, and his eyes, they weren't focused on Hale. They were fixed somewhere above No. "Behind him, they're almost awake," Carson said softly. His voice was flat, as if stating a fact rather than offering an opinion. Christina's pulse spiked. "Who's they?" she asked before she could stop herself. Carson finally turned to face them fully, and Christina instantly wished he hadn't. His lab coat was buttoned neatly, but the front was smeared with something dark, not blood exactly, but a brownish-black residue that clung in patches. His gloves were gone, and his fingernails were rimmed with the same substance. "You shouldn't be here," he said simply. "It's too late to stop it." Hale's flashlight swept over the tables. Christina followed the beam and her stomach. Dropped, the twins' eyes were open. Not wide, not glassy in the way of the dead. Just open. Their gaze was fixed on the ceiling, unblinking, their chests utterly still. Christina's breath caught. "No, they've been listening all night," Carson murmured, stepping closer to the bodies. "And now they want to see you." Hale's hand went to his weapon. "Step away from the tables, Doctor." Carson smiled faintly, but it wasn't. "Warm, if you insist." He took a deliberate step back, and as he did, the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 5 degrees. Christina could see her breath. One of the twins, she thought it was the younger, but it was impossible to tell, moved. Not much, just the faintest twitch in the corner of his mouth, like the ghost of a smile. Christina stumbled back. The overhead lights flickered. Once, twice, then plunged the room into near darkness. Save for Hale's narrow flashlight beam and that split second of dark, Christina swore she saw someone else standing between the tables, small, no taller than a child, head tilted upward as if staring directly at her. The light snapped back on. The space between the tables was empty. Carson was gone. Hale swept the beam across the room. Toward the far door leading to the storage hallway, it swung slowly on its hinges as if someone had just slipped through. "Stay here," Hale ordered. Already moving toward it, Christina grabbed his arm. "No, don't leave me in here." But he was gone before she could finish. She stood there, alone with the twins. The hum of the ventilation system suddenly unbearably loud. Their open eyes seemed to follow her, though their heads didn't move. Something whispered her name. She spun, heart pounding, but there was no one behind her. The whisper came again, closer this time. Right by her ear, and then she realized it was both of them. The sound wasn't coming from one voice. It was 2 voices, speaking at once, just slightly out of sync. "Christina, we remember you." Her knees nearly gave out. The hallway door slammed shut somewhere beyond, followed by Hale's voice shouting her name, but she couldn't move. Couldn't answer, because the twins were smiling now, The morgue was quieter than it had been all night. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was pressurized. Like the room itself was holding its breath, Dr. Harris stood over the metal slab where the twins' bodies rested. The silver light from the overhead lamp painting them in a cold metallic glow. Christina was in the corner, her arms wrapped around herself. She didn't speak. She barely even blinked. The bodies hadn't moved, but the air felt different. Harris adjusted his gloves, more to give his trembling hands something to do than out of necessity. He leaned over the first twin, his face tight with concentration. There. It was again a faint sound. It wasn't laughter this time. It was more like the fragile hum of a lullaby, familiar, warm, almost maternal. But it had no source. He scanned the room. The hum wasn't coming from the ventilation or from the hallway. It was coming from between the two bodies. Harris froze. The twins lay on separate slabs, but their hands, cold pale, were almost touching. Just an inch. Apart, without thinking, he moved them slightly closer. The moment their fingertips brushed, Christina gasped. The hum spiked into a sharp, ringing tone. The fluorescent lights above flickered violently, throwing shadows across the walls, and then their eyes opened, not wide, not with life, just a slow, synchronized lift of the eyelids, revealing the dull, cloudy irises of the dead. Christina stumbled back, her heel catching on the corner of the cabinet. Oh my God. Harris's medical mind wanted to explain it away, post-mortem muscle contractions, electrical interference, anything. But no explanation could match the truth. Pressing in on him, the twins weren't. Alone, he stepped back, watching as their lips moved soundlessly at first, then forming whispers. The words were too faint to understand, like a conversation heard from the bottom of a well. Christina, record this, Harris said, his voice low, urgent. She fumbled for her phone, lifting it with trembling hands. The whispers grew louder, almost layered as though two voices were speaking. But under them was a third, deeper tone. Not supposed. Be here, he promised. Can't leave. Christina's phone began to heat in her hand. She hissed, nearly dropping it. It's burning. The twins' heads slowly turned toward her, still speaking, their milky eyes unblinking. The deeper voice grew clearer, almost rising. Above theirs, it wasn't in English. The syllables were jagged, old, wrong. Harris felt his stomach twist. He'd heard something like it once before in a case file he wasn't supposed to read. A year ago, family had been found dead in their home, all positioned in a perfect circle. The police report had mentioned an unknown vocalization. Recorded on a neighbor's security camera, no one had been able to translate it until now, because this was the same voice. Christina backed toward the door. We should go. Right now. Please." The morgue's metal door slammed shut before she could reach it. The sound was so loud it rattled the glass jars on the counter. Both twins began to smile. It was slow, and Harris realized they weren't smiling at him. They were smiling at something standing behind him. He turned, pulse spiking, but there was nothing there. Nothing but a cold spot in the air so deep it made his teeth ache. Then, without warning, both bodies sat upright. Not in a jerky, unnatural horror movie way. In a calm, deliberate motion, as if they'd simply decided to wake from a nap. They looked at each other, then at Harris, and Christina then began speaking in that third voice again. This time, Harris understood enough to piece together fragments. A warning, a name. Promise broken. The name was one he'd heard whispered once in the old records room, scratched into the back of a forgotten autopsy folder. Calvin Eth. The promise. But the word return kept repeating. The temperature in the room dropped sharply. Christina's breath was visible in the air, and then suddenly as it began. The twins lay back down, their eyes closed. The hum faded. The cold spot vanished. The room was still again. Christina's voice cracked. What? What was that? Harris didn't answer, because deep down, he already knew. This wasn't just a morgue anymore, it was a door. And tonight, It had opened. The diner felt different that morning, not because of the sunlight spilling across the counter, nor the fresh batch of cinnamon rolls cooling on the rack, but because every seat was filled with faces from the past few weeks, people whose lives had somehow crossed through hers, people who had, without even realizing it, become a part of this story. Margaret stood behind the counter, hands steady but heart full. She had seen the way each person's eyes followed her with something that wasn't pity, wasn't judgment, but respect. At the corner booth, Michael sat with his sister, the same quiet boy who had first stepped into her diner looking lost and hollow. He was laughing now, laughing, and every time he glanced toward her, he gave a small nod, like a silent thank you that didn't need words. The bell over the door jingled. Margaret turned and froze. It was Daniel. He wasn't in his usual crisp suit today. Instead, he wore a simple sweater, hands in his pockets, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. Behind him, two of the same black SUVs she had seen that unforgettable morning were parked outside. He approached the counter slowly, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. I kept thinking, if I didn't walk in that day, I never would have met the woman who reminded me what kindness actually looks like. Margaret felt a sting in her eyes. She chuckled softly, shaking her head. I didn't do anything special. Daniel's smile deepened. You fed a boy without asking for anything? You gave me a reason to look past the walls I built around my life? That's more than special. He placed an envelope on the counter. No explanation, no ceremony. Just a simple gesture. She didn't need to open it to know it. It wasn't small. But the money wasn't the gift. The real gift was knowing she had mattered. That in a world that could be cold and busy, her quiet acts of care had rippled far further than she ever imagined. As Daniel turned to leave, Michael's voice called out from the booth. Margaret, can I help with the dishes today? She laughed. If you're willing to get your hands wet, sure. The room filled again with gentle chatter, clinking mugs, and the smell of fresh coffee. It was an ordinary morning, and yet it was the kind of ordinary that made life worth living. Margaret realized something then. Happy endings weren't always about grand changes or miracles. Sometimes they were about moments like this, the quiet. It's unshakable knowledge that you had made someone's life a little warmer, a little easier to carry. And as the sunlight touched the diner's worn floors, she smiled, knowing this was exactly where she was meant to be.